Hey everybody, over the last couple of years I've looked at a variety of B550 motherboards, focusing on those that have a good balance of features to price. I chose to focus on B550 boards because of their affordability when compared to their X570 counterparts and their richness in features when compared to A520 motherboards. While the B550 chipset offers a good middle ground of features, many were still fairly expensive upon initial release, especially when compared to their much cheaper B450 counterparts. It's great all B550 motherboards come standard with a single PCIe 4.0 slot for the current GPUs, as well as one PCIe 4.0 NVMe slot for fast storage, if your CPU can take advantage of those things, of course. Additionally, many might even have a 2.5 gigabit LAN port instead of a 1 gigabit port, or a USB 3.2 Type-C port either on the rear I/O, internally for your case, or both. However, I'd argue the presence of a rear and internal Type-C connections should be a standard feature by now, rather than a premium one. What hasn't become standard and still remains a price premium reserved either only for the most expensive of B550 motherboards or mid-tier and higher X570 motherboards are onboard power and reset buttons and an alphanumeric debug LED. And this ASRock B550 PG Velocita is no exception. Well, at least it was when it still cost $219.99. Thankfully, its price has declined, and at the time of this video, you can purchase the PG Velocita for as low as $150 US, making it a tantalizing option as the scales of features and price are now very balanced. Today we're going to unbox this motherboard, see what features it offers, see what features it's lacking, and determine whether or not it's worthy of your hard-earned money. Welcome to the middle of nowhere. As with most of my motherboard reviews, I like to go over the box just because of the design and look of the motherboard box is interesting to me. So before going inside, let's do that. It has aggressive angular lines denoting speed, which makes sense considering Velocita is Italian for velocity, of which speed is a synonym. For those unfamiliar with this line of ASRock motherboards, the large PG right here stands for Phantom Gaming, and the Velocita is at the top of this line, which is aimed at those with motherboard budgets ranging from the low to middle high. Other details on the front include the B550 chipset and AM4 socket information, as well as a logo stating this motherboard is Ryzen 3rd Gen ready. This refers to Ryzen 3000 CPUs, and while the sticker says the motherboard doesn't support Ryzen 3200G or 3400G CPUs, as of the P2.0 BIOS and higher, it will. What's concerning is the lack of a Ryzen 5000 ready sticker on this box, which means depending on the BIOS that came with this motherboard, I may need to update it before I can use a 5000 series CPU. The sides don't have much information other than the part and serial number, which you'll need when registering the board for your warranty. On the back, you'll find a glut of information about the motherboard and a picture of it and the rear I/O. So if you're browsing for motherboards in a physical store like Micro Center or Best Buy, there's plenty of information here for you to learn about the PG Velocita. Next, let's have a look what's inside the box. You're gonna open it with these two tabs here, just pull them out, and then you're gonna hopefully easily pull this out by the handle, or just do the whole shimmy method, because this thing has a death grip and you don't want to necessarily rip the box. There we go. After removing the outer box from the inner, which seems to have a death grip on it, you'll first see all the accessories included with the PG Velocita. There's your quick installation guide, which is in multiple languages. The manual goes over the motherboard in detail and also has installation instructions for various components, debug codes, and more. I'm definitely glad this is present. It's rather thick, but do realize again that because this is in multiple languages, English is basically, the first 50 pages or so. So the rest is all other different languages, which is good to have multilingual support. Underneath that is a software setup guide, which walks you through the BIOS and gives a brief explanation of what each thing does, which is kind of cool as well. So seeing a guide to the BIOS, which is really a giant kind of barrier for people who aren't familiar with it to be able to do things with it. So having these explanations, whether or not they're good, I haven't fully looked at this, so whether or not they're thorough and good is another matter altogether, but at least it's there. So it also goes over, looks like the software, not just within the BIOS, but the utilities that you can download as well. In two one-use plastic bags, you'll find a total of 4 SATA cables, and in 5 comedically resealable bags, but also plastic as well, you will find a couple of standoffs and M.2 screws. And then here we have a fancy envelope. Within this, you will find an outdated CD-ROM of software, or a coaster if you want. some stickers, some of which can actually be beneficial for cable management. The rest can be just used for funsies. Some Velcro straps in a resealable plastic bag. And finally, a postcard that you can send to your enemy to make them jealous by letting them know that you have the latest awesome motherboard from ASRock. Underneath that, we have the motherboard itself. It is in an anti-static plastic bag. And it is further protected by some foam. And you'll see that the foam is attached by zip ties on the four corners. Overall, the PG Velocita is presented nicely and includes necessary accessories with a minimum of fluff. I do have a few gripes though. There are way too many bits of useless plastic in this box. The SATA cables, screws, and standoffs could have been easily combined into two resealable bags. The Velcro straps don't need to be put in plastic when they're already tucked away into an envelope. And finally, the CD-ROM should be replaced with a USB drive. Do better, ASRock. Eliminate or at least reduce single-use plastic and start using biodegradable packaging. The PG Velocita has a two-tone color scheme with red accents, and it maintains that aggressive speed line design present on the box. There are two zones of RGB, one on the I/O shroud and the wording right there, and the chipset heatsink as well. Both of which, as well as the M.2 heatsinks, are a mixture of silver or steel and black with red accents. There are also red accents on the PCB, and while the color scheme definitely makes the Velocita stand out when compared to the dozens of just black motherboards out there, some might find this design too loud or clashing with their build. For those who do think this, let me just say I don't think you'll really notice the blacks and reds as much as the silver tones, especially once you have a CPU cooler and GPU installed, as much of it will be pretty much covered. Overall, I like the design, but if I were to make a change, I might at a minimum remove the red bits, as those are going to stand out the most. Now let's see what features the PG Velocita has. Starting with the form factor, the ASRock B550 PG Velocita is an ATX motherboard and measures 12 inches by 9.6 inches or 305mm by 244mm. The motherboard supports a wide variety of CPUs, and depending on the BIOS that comes with the motherboard or that you've installed, you can use almost any Ryzen 3000, 3000G, 4000G, or 5000 and 5000G series CPU. Zen and Zen Plus or Ryzen 1000 and 2000 series CPUs do not seem to be compatible with the PG Velocita. For a complete list of compatible CPUs and the minimum BIOS version you need installed to use them, refer to the link I've provided in the description. You'll find 4 slots for your RAM on the motherboard with dual channel support. If you need a ton of memory, you're in luck, as you can install up to 128GB. Memory speed compatibility is determined by the CPU install, so do be aware of that, but the range is 2133 all the way up to 4733 megatransfers per second. As always, I recommend finding a RAM kit that has a good price to speed ratio and one that enables you to keep a 1-to-1 ratio with the Infinity Fabric, and this usually means 3600, 3733, or 3800 megatransfers per second for Ryzen 5000 series CPUs. But the latter two speeds might require some manual overclocking. If you want to just set XMP and forget it, then I recommend sticking with DDR4 3600 and try to find a CAS latency of 16 or lower. There is also support for ECC and non-ECC unbuffered memory if you have a Ryzen Pro CPU. Finally, if you're only using 2 sticks of RAM, you want to install them in the slots marked DIMM A2 and DIMM B2, or the second and fourth slots when going away from the CPU. This way you can take advantage of dual channel speeds. There are 4 PCIe slots on the PG Velocita. The top slot is by 16 in length and speed, and it's the slot to use for your GPU. If you're using a Ryzen 3000 or 5000 series CPU, your GPU will run at PCIe 4.0 speeds if it's a Gen 4 card. Using a Ryzen 3000G, 4000G, or 5000G series CPU will restrict you to PCIe 3.0 speeds. Both the top slot and the second full-length slot are reinforced with steel. This reinforcement provides extra stability for those bulky GPUs, and according to ASRock, also ensures signal stability. The second and third slots are PCIe 3.0 slots and are by 1 in length and speed. You might use these slots for a sound card, a 1080p capture card, or even a Wi-Fi card. The bottom slot is PCIe 3.0 and is by 16 in length, but by 4 in speed. You might use this slot to install a 4K capture card, a 10GB Ethernet card, or Thunderbolt or USB 3.2 expansion card. There are 2 4-pin RGB headers and 2 3-pin ARGB headers on the PG Velocita. This is a pretty good amount and should help you connect most of your colorful accessories. I would have liked to have seen 3 ARGB headers and 1 RGB header instead, as ARGB has become much more common in recent years. Additionally, as I said when going over the motherboard's design, there are 2 zones of lighting on the PG Velocita, the I/O cover and the chipset cover. You can control the motherboard lighting and any RGB strips or fans connected to it with ASRock's Polychrome Sync. I've used this software in the past and honestly, I hate it. It's clunky, the effects aren't many, and it's just not that good. If ASRock has not improved their software in the 7 or 8 months since I last used it, then I highly recommend you find an alternative to control your PC lighting. There are 7 4-pin PWM fan headers on this motherboard, and they're all well positioned. I love seeing a large amount of fan headers on a motherboard as it provides you with many options for connection. At the top you'll find the CPU 1 and CPU fan 2/water pump headers. If you are air cooling, connect your fan into CPU fan 1, and if you're using an IO water cooler, connect your pump into CPU fan 2/water pump. The remaining 5 PWM fan headers are strategically placed throughout the motherboard and can be used for either a case fan or a water pump if you're doing a custom loop. I really like the one fan header placed to the left of the CPU, as this will accommodate your rear exhaust fan really well. You may, however, have to do some creative cable management so the cord isn't too visible. You'll definitely be able to install a load of storage devices on the PG Velocita. There are 6 SATA 3 or 6 gigabit per second ports, which will allow you to connect plenty of hard drives, optical drives, or other SATA devices. You'll also find 2 M.2 slots on the motherboard, both with included heat sinks to keep your drive temperatures down. The top M.2 slot operates at PCIe 4.0 by 4 speeds should you have a Ryzen 5000 or 3000 series CPU. Other CPUs will operate at PCIe 3.0 by 4 speeds. The lower M.2 slot supports both PCIe and SATA 3 M.2 drives. Do be aware though that the PCIe drive will operate at 3.0 by 2 speeds. If you do use the lower M.2 slot, also be aware you'll lose use of SATA ports 5 and 6 or the lowest 2 ports on the motherboard. I don't find losing use of 2 SATA ports to be too big of a deal, as 4 SATA ports should be sufficient for most users. Additionally, PCIe 3.0 drives, even if at by 2 speeds instead of by 4, are still very fast. You'll get about 16 gigabits per second of transfer speeds, whereas a SATA drive only gets 6. In megabytes, this is 2000 and 600 respectively. I'd recommend sacrificing 2 SATA ports all day, every day to install a second PCIe M.2 drive, as you're getting those faster transfer speeds and you also don't have to deal with additional cables. If you want to set up a RAID, there is support for 0, 1, or 10 with your SATA devices. From my research, it does not look like you can set up any kind of RAID with your M.2 drives, however I could be wrong, so feel free to correct me in the comments below. In addition to all the fan and RGB headers, the PG Velocita comes with a decent number of internal connectors and buttons. Starting with the power connectors, you'll find your usual 24-pin ATX main power connector on the right side of the motherboard. To power your CPU, you'll find an 8-pin ATX 12-volt power connector at the top left and a 4-pin supplemental CPU power connector next to it. While you must plug in the 8-pin power connector, you don't really need to plug in the 4-pin unless you're overclocking your CPU or unless your workload demands more power from your CPU. Having said that, it won't hurt to plug in both the 8-pin and 4-pin power connectors. Just make sure your power supply can accommodate this, as not every PSU comes with 2 4+4 CPU power connectors. You'll find the majority of your headers and buttons at the bottom of the motherboard, with a couple on the side as well. At the bottom, starting from left to right, you will find the HD audio connector for your case's front audio. Next to that are the ARGB and RGB connectors and the 2 fan headers, which I've already covered. After those are 2 USB 2.0 internal headers. If you've ever used any Corsair iCUE devices, you'll definitely have made use of these. After the USB headers, you'll find the onboard power and reset buttons. That's right, I said power and reset buttons. This is the first B550 motherboard I've seen with this feature that wasn't $250 or more. Even at its original $220 price point, seeing these 2 buttons on the PG Velocita is pretty cool, and to have them at a $132 price point, which is what I paid, is even cooler. To the right of those 2 buttons is the clear CMOS jumper. I will say it's a shame ASRock didn't spring for a button here. I mean, go big or go home. If you're gonna have buttons for power and reset, have a dang clear CMOS button too. Below the CMOS jumper is the speaker connector, and next to that is your front panel connector for your PC case's power and reset buttons and hard drive activity light should your case have one or more of these things. Above the front panel connector, you'll find a Dr.Debug LED. This provides you with a 2-digit or letter code that you can then look up in the manual to see what might be wrong with your PC. This can greatly aid in troubleshooting, as the code will better help you, or at least it should, narrow down the issue over just a standard LED light. I do find it surprising, however, that you don't get the 4 troubleshoot LEDs in addition to the code reader. I also do want to point out that the description of the code in the manual is not very helpful. I don't understand what half these terms mean. While some are easier to understand than others, it would have been nice for ASRock to include better descriptions of the codes. As it stands, the Dr.Debug LED is a great nice to have, but without proper documentation to tell you what these codes mean, it's less than useless. On the side of the motherboard, below the 24-pin ATX connector, you'll find USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C and USB 3.2 Gen 1 front panel connections. I definitely like seeing the front Type-C port on this motherboard. I really think it needs to become more prevalent and really a standard by now. It's just become so common that both motherboards and cases really need to start including it. Finally, there's a dedicated TPM connector in the middle of the motherboard to the right of the top M.2 slot. Not sure what a TPM connector is used for? Check out my video on the topic. If you end up buying a TPM module for this motherboard, you'll want to make sure it's a 14-1 or 13-pin TPM-SPI module, and be sure to get one made by ASRock. I recommend contacting ASRock customer support to get a specific model number compatible with the PG Velocita. There doesn't seem to be any other connectors such as a serial or COM port on this motherboard, so if you need those, you'll have to look elsewhere. Of note, if you're unsure which BIOS version came installed with your PG Velocita, you're in luck. ASRock includes a sticker with the BIOS version on the chip. You can see here that I have version 1.10. This is a great way to know if your CPU will be supported out of the box. Unfortunately, ASRock didn't add Ryzen 5000 series support until BIOS version 1.20, and I plan on using a 5900X with this motherboard. However, I do have a 3300X, so I should be able to install and update the BIOS no problem, but this still presents itself as an inconvenience because there is no BIOS flashback button on this PG Velocita. And what this means is there is no button for me to push that I can then update the BIOS even if I don't have a CPU or memory installed, unlike a lot of the other B550 motherboards I've covered, such as the ASUS ROG Strix B550 Gaming. While I tried to research the audio solution ASRock provides as best I could, it was hard to get specifics on what the jargon-laden audio features the PG Velocita provides. Even the product page and full manual was light on information. Suffice it to say, the PG Velocita supports 7.1 channel surround sound and uses the Realtek ALC1220 audio codec, as well as 𝐬𝐈𝐼𝐷 Audio by SteelSeries. 𝐬𝐈𝐼𝐷 Audio provides spatial audio and comes with companion software. As with many modern motherboards, the PG Velocita uses PCB shielding to isolate the audio components from the rest of the motherboard to reduce or eliminate any electronic interference that might degrade your listening experience. There's Blu-ray support as well as surge protection support, and there's a 120 decibel SNR DAC with a differential amplifier. Finally, the front panel audio has an NE5532 headphone amplifier and supports up to 600 ohm headsets. There's one more thing you may have spotted on the motherboard, and that's an M.2 slot for a wireless card. The rear I/O, which I'll get to in a moment, has antenna punch-out holes already present if you want to use those instead of a PCI slot. It's pretty cool ASRock included the slot to add a wireless card, as there is no actual wireless version. I don't mind this because it lets me choose which Wi-Fi solution to install. If you intend to add a Wi-Fi card, be sure to search for M.2 cards that are an E key and are 2230 in length. One such solution I've been looking at is the Intel AX200. It has Wi-Fi 6 AX support, which is backwards compatible with any other Wi-Fi standard, as well as support for Bluetooth 5.2. What I like about the presence of this slot is you can upgrade it as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth standards evolve. Now we come to the rear I/O of the PG Velocita, which is loaded. One of the first things you'll notice is the integrated I/O shield. I love this feature and wish it was just standard on all motherboards, not just the premium ones. At the top is the HDMI 2.1 port. It supports a max resolution of 4096 by 2160 at 60 Hz, HDCP 2.3, 4K Ultra HD playback, high bitrate audio, and HDR or high dynamic range content. Above the HDMI port is a conspicuously empty area. This is where the clear CMOS and BIOS flash buttons should be. Unfortunately, ASRock did not include clear CMOS or BIOS flash buttons on the PG Velocita. Without a BIOS flash button, you won't be able to flash the BIOS without a CPU or memory installed. This is a huge misstep by ASRock, especially on a motherboard with an original MSRP of $220. If you're going to price a motherboard that high, then a BIOS flash button needs to be present. Next up is the antiquated serial port. Sure, let's not have a BIOS flash button, but let's do include a serial port. I don't know why. Below the HDMI port are 8 USB ports. You'll find 4 USB 2.0 ports, 2 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports, and 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports, one of which is a Type-C port. I like seeing so many USB ports, but I would have preferred those 4 USB 2.0 ports to have been 4 USB 3.2 Gen 1 ports instead. All USB ports have ESD protection, and the USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C port has 3 amps of charging power compared to the 1.5 amps found in the USB 3.2 Gen 1 Type A ports. Next up is the LAN port. This is the Phantom Gaming 2.5 gigabit per second port that uses the Realtek RTL8125BG solution. I really don't have too much to say about this other than it's pretty nice to have such a speedy port on a motherboard for those who are going to be using maybe network attached storage devices or setting up a home server. You'll want that increased speed that you would get on a 2.5 gigabit per second port over a standard 1 gigabit per second port. Below the LAN port is the aforementioned Wi-Fi antenna holes, and below those are the audio ports. You'll find 5 gold-plated audio jacks and 1 optical SPDIF out port. With these outputs, you'll be able to set up 2, 4, 5.1, or 7.1 channel sound, or connect external devices such as a receiver. Finally, let's talk about power delivery for a moment. The ASRock B550 PG Velocita has a 14-phase or 12+2 power delivery. It uses premium 60-amp chokes and Nichicon 12K black caps. It also makes use of DR-MOS, a digital power delivery solution. With DR-MOS, 50 amps of continuous power for each phase can be delivered, which according to ASRock, this gives improved thermal results and better performance. Covering the VRM are 2 heat sinks connected by a heat pipe. Seeing a heat pipe instead of just slabs of metal is reassuring, as it means the VRMs should receive adequate cooling. Ultimately, a good power delivery and cooling solution means you'll be able to sustain higher clock speeds for longer when putting your CPU to the test with demanding workloads. Additionally, if you plan on overclocking, you'll have more headroom to push your CPU even further. The ASRock B550 PG Velocita provides an interesting choice for a B550 motherboard. Based on its current price, it has some luxury features you won't find on similarly priced motherboards. Heck, even at its original MSRP, you'd be hard-pressed to find another B550 motherboard with onboard power and reset buttons or debug code reader. That the PG Velocita has a 2.5 gigabit LAN solution in addition to 2 USB 3.2 Gen 2 ports on the back, one Type A and one Type C, and a USB 3.2 Gen 2 front panel connection, and an affordable cost of $150 at the time of this video, makes this motherboard a very compelling option indeed. However, the PG Velocita lacks one glaring feature, a feature present in many other B550 motherboards. Motherboards that are either currently cheaper or similarly priced to the Velocita. That feature, of course, is the BIOS flash button. Because B550 boards were released in mid-2020 and Ryzen 5000 series CPUs were released that autumn, it's most likely motherboard manufacturers knew AMD wouldn't be introducing a new chipset for Zen 3 CPUs, so they acted accordingly by including a BIOS flash button on many lower-end to mid-tier and higher motherboards. This way, customers could flash the motherboard before installing that lovely Ryzen 5000 series CPU and not have any issues. Why ASRock didn't include this feature on the PG Velocita when it cost $220 at release is mind-boggling. Why include high-end features like onboard power and reset, but leave out something common sense like a BIOS flash button? If you buy this motherboard and it doesn't have that reassuring Ryzen 5000 ready sticker on the box, or a BIOS version sticker of P1.20 or later on the BIOS chip, you won't be able to use it with the Ryzen 5000 series CPU without first updating the BIOS. And the average person just doesn't have a spare Ryzen 3000 series CPU lying around. Can you see the conundrum here? This is a fantastic motherboard, but if I'm viewing it from the perspective of a buyer for an entire new build, or someone swapping from Intel to AMD, then it's a crapshoot as to whether or not you'll get a Ryzen 5000 ready board. I mean, since it's been 1.5 years, the odds are that it will have that sticker are in your favor, but do you really want to take that gamble? Finally, another thing to consider is the bottom M.2 slot only operates at by 2 speeds for PCIe NVMe drives. This might not be a deal breaker, but it is something to think about if you plan on using M.2 slots and need all the speed you can get from your storage devices. So bottom line, would I recommend this motherboard based on all this information? At its current price range, the features offered are very good. So my answer is yes, but maybe look around. If you're building a PC, definitely give this motherboard a look to see if it fits your needs, but also look around for motherboards comparably priced to see what features they offer. You never know, you might find something better. I also want to add, I'm super glad ASRock adds that little BIOS version sticker to their motherboards. And in fact, they might be the only company to do so. For my B550M Aorus Pro P, I had to contact Gigabyte to find out which BIOS version the motherboard shipped with. Adding that little sticker is such an informative, time-saving, and inexpensive solution. Asus, MSI, Gigabyte, please start doing this. To ASRock, I'll say this. If you're going to charge $220 for a motherboard, include a friggin' BIOS flash button. It'll make everyone's lives a lot easier. And that's it for this deep dive into the ASRock B550 PG Velocita. I'll be putting it in my next PC build, so get subscribed so you don't miss out on that video. Thanks for watching, everybody. If you enjoyed the video or found it helpful, hit that like button and share any questions or comments you have down below. You can show your support for the channel by clicking subscribe, and don't forget to click that notification icon so you don't miss out on any future content. And hey, while you're here, why not check out some of the other videos I've made? I'm Seth, and I'll see you next time in the middle of nowhere.